Mm. Okay, it's two right now. Let's get started. We have over 20 attendees already, and the number is still soaring. And hello, everyone. Welcome to Ask Seminar series. And I'm John, the seminar coordinator. So I'll be moderating this seminar with Kathy Medley, our communication specialist. And just so you know that the seminar is being recorded, and we will publish the video recording on our YouTube channel. And please feel free to bring up any questions usually after the presentation. And you can unmute yourself to ask a verbal question, or you can chat us your questions, and we will read them out. So before the speaker gets started, since our interim director, Ralph Ferrero, is also here, I will need Ralph to introduce the speaker. So Ralph, please proceed.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, John. Yeah, and it's a pleasure to have Professor Daniel Horton from Northwestern University, associate professor, the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. He does focuses his research on climate and its impacts on people. Got an interesting topic coming up. Let's see, he's got his degrees from a bunch of different schools, Tulane University, Texas A&M, and his PhD from the University of Michigan. Also, he gets a lot of support from NASA, Department of Energy, and NSF, amongst other places. And let's see, he did postdoc at Stanford, and he also is a forecaster for the U.S. Air Force as well, which is interesting experience. So at this point, I'll just turn it over to Daniel. I think it's going to be a really interesting topic.
All right, thank you, Ralph. I will attempt to share my screen. All right, are we looking good?
Looks great.
Thank you. All right, thanks everybody for joining us today, and thank you for the invitation to present. As Ralph said, I am an associate professor at Northwestern University in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. I do a whole bunch of different things from an Earth system science perspective, so it's great to be able to talk to an Earth system science group. But today I'm going to be talking about some air quality work that we've done recently. All right, so this is a slide I've taken to showing recently for both my public outreach talks, but also my academic talks. And I like to think about it as like a cartoon of where the field is at, or probably more accurately, where my head is at in terms of what excites me from a research perspective. And so on the x-axis here is you're looking at time, and then on the y-axis, you're looking at our understanding and advances. And the point I'm trying to make here is that our understanding of physics and chemistry of the climate system is to the point that we can build very robust numerical models and make excellent predictions with them. With these tools, we can also start to assess climate change impacts. And this is what I like to think about as the intersection of climate change or atmospheric phenomenon and people, places, and things. This is where kind of aligns with my career track in that I started to think a lot about impacts after I finished my PhD and moved into a postdoc at Stanford, really zeroing in on how are people, places, and things going to experience climate change. And it turns out if you do that long enough, it's kind of depressing. And so as a professor, I've really taken it upon myself to focus more and more on solutions. And that's mainly what I'll talk about today. I have explored solutions that have to do with land surface hazards, solutions that have to do with extreme heat. But today we're going to be talking about air quality. And I first started to think about air quality while a postdoc. As a graduate student at Michigan, I studied deep time paleoclimate, and but learned the tools of GCMs, or general circulation models. And one of the first things I did when I got to Stanford was want to learn about ensembles. And so the first study I did down in the lower left in 2012 was a study using the CMIP3 ensemble and exploring the meteorology that allows poor air quality to form. And so this is a phenomenon known as atmospheric stagnation. And, you know, these giant Earth system or general circulation models are a decent tool for examining these larger scale phenomena like stagnation. And this is, it doesn't tell us when the air quality is bad because the pollutants don't exist in these particular models, but we can get at the effects of increased radiative forcing on the meteorology that allows pollutants to accumulate in the near surface environment. And so we did this with CMIP3, we did it with CMIP5 a little bit later. And then just a couple of years ago, I collaborated with a group out of Madrid that used CMIP6 to do this study all over again. And the good news is that over successive generations of CMIP models, we see relatively consistent projections of how the meteorology that controls air quality will change moving forward. And so with simulations like that and projections like that, there's a lot of motivation to better understand the solution. So how do we limit that changing meteorology? And so, you know, in the US, the transportation sector is responsible for about 29% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, one of the other things we can talk about is the emissions or the traffic-related emissions or air pollution that comes out of tailpipes. And so on the right-hand side, you have a litany of health impacts from traffic-related air pollution. And when we have these two kind of simultaneous effects, climate change or enhanced radiative forcing from the greenhouse gases and poor health from exposure to poor air quality, this suggests that an opportunity for co-beneficial outcomes if we do something to eliminate emissions. And this is a solution to climate change or to global warming that I've become quite interested in, doing things kind of two birds, one stone sort of solutions. And so the research that I'll talk about today, the estimates of tract-level air quality in Chicago and the public health and equity implications of multi-modal vehicle electrification, was largely motivated by the Justice 40 initiative, which is an initiative that was implemented by the Biden and Harris administration in the very beginning. And what it said is that about 40% of federal investment benefits were to go to disadvantaged communities. And this definition and the motivations behind this particular initiative are hotly debated. So we can debate the word disadvantage, we can debate communities, we can debate benefits. And what I like to say is that the research is very loosely based on this. But for us to be able to make these kind of determinations on where the benefits are going from various investments, we need to be able to resolve environmental conditions at really high resolutions. And so when we're talking about air quality, and particularly air quality as it pertains to an urban environment, and trying to tease out who benefits and who doesn't benefit from certain policies, we need to first be able to characterize exposure gradients. And often these exposure gradients and pollutants are very steep in an urban environment, and I'll show some examples of that in a bit. Other gradients that are very steep in an urban environment include demographics. And so many cities are quite segregated. And then there's also health gradients that we see across cities. And so these are all things that we need to be able to quantify to say something about environmental justice outcomes. And if we look at the plot on the right-hand side, this is just the gold standard EPA monitor locations as they're scattered throughout the Chicagoland region, different colors for different pollutants. And what you'll notice is that, number one, there's not a lot of them, and there's almost none in downtown Chicago. And so this observation network was not designed to be able to assess gradients and pollution across urban environments. And so with that motivation, we need physics and chemistry-based tools to estimate impacts of proposed policies in environments like Chicago. So the tool that my group has chosen to use is a model that the EPA created by the name of WRF-CMAQ. And much of this work was performed by a graduate student of mine who has since moved on. Her name is Anastasia Montgomery. And she was a mentor by myself, but also by Jordan Schnell, who was a postdoc in my group at that time. And this particular model is a two-way coupled model, which means that it has both meteorology and in the form of WRF, and a chemical transport model in the form of CMAQ. And these models communicate with one another. So the pollution that is simulated by the CTM influences the amount of radiation that's involved in the meteorology. This model, we run it at a high resolution. And so what do I mean by high resolution? In this case, we're running it at 1.3 kilometers. But to get down to 1.3 kilometers, we start with a CONUS domain that's at 12 kilometers, and then a 4-kilometer domain, which is nested within that, and then follow that up with a 1.3 kilometer domain over our area, which is just the southern half of Lake Michigan and the states that surround it. To be able to do this and to simulate air quality at 1.3 kilometers, we use a data set from the Lake Michigan Air Directors Consortium. And in particular, it's called surrogates. And surrogates essentially take county-level national emissions inventory data and allots it to a grid that is resolved below the county level. And so in our case, a 1.3 kilometer grid. The WRF-CMAQ model includes many, many bells and whistles that make up the Earth system. And so it includes things like direct emissions from transportation sources or mobile sources, agricultural emissions. It includes lots of chemical processes. So multi-phase chemistry, so we're forming secondary pollutants like ozone and some types of particulate matter. But we're also seeing biogenic emissions and so on and so forth. And so what does all that look like from in the model after we put it all in there and run it? Well, it looks like this. Here's our plot. That's our full domain is in the picture here. What you see in the middle there is Lake Michigan, or the southern end of Lake Michigan, and the various states that surround Lake Michigan. The purple color here, you're looking at ozone concentrations. And I think the first thing to notice with this plot is that it makes incredibly beautiful plots, right? Particularly when we animate them, we see all sorts of somewhat realistic features, I would argue. And we can see also underlying the data, there's the EPA monitors that are scattered across our region. And ideally, they light up in similar colors to what the model is simulating. On the bottom animation on the left-hand side, you can see the diurnal variability of both the EPA monitors and the CMAQ simulation. And so you can see that it tracks the diurnal variability of ozone relatively well. And on the right-hand side, on the bottom, you're looking at one-to-one plots of the CMAQ simulation grid cells and the corresponding station observations across the domain. And you can see it changes, how well the model performs changes on a daily basis or even an hourly basis here. And if you froze this and did the analysis, you'd know that CMAQ is biased slightly high in terms of ozone performance. But by and large, you could say that the model does an admirable job. All right, so if we take some averages, and in this case, this model is computationally expensive. And so to deal with that computational expense, we've designed a simulations that simulate 1 month from each season. And then we average those 4 months together to create what we call an annualized mean. And you're here looking at nitrogen dioxide on the top, ozone in the middle, and particulate matter on the bottom. This is the full domain, and perhaps particularly in the NO2 and PM plots, what you can largely see here is towns and roadways. So where lots of people live or lots of people drive start to show up on these depictions. And it's pretty remarkable that we're picking up on basically the US highway system with these simulations. But most of the action occurs over Chicago. And so let's zoom in on Chicago to see what that looks like. So on the right-hand side, this is the outline of Chicago looks like. That weird thing on the left-hand side is O'Hare Airport. And then your eye is instantly drawn on these plots to the highway system. And so let me just show you where the highways are across the Chicagoland area. Down in the kind of the center of Chicago is the area known as the Loop, which if you've been to Chicago, you may have been to. It's got lots of tall buildings. It's a beautiful part of town. And then there's highways that sprawl out from there. And you'll notice that when we're talking about nitrogen dioxide pollution, they track the highways quite well. Ozone is kind of the reverse pattern because of the relationship between ozone and NO2, or rather NO. And then particulate matter is a little bit more diffuse, but again, tracks the highways decently. Okay, so to verify this sort of simulation, I mentioned earlier that there's not a lot of EPA monitors in downtown Chicago. And so when we run a simulation like this and we're trying to compare against the gold standard observations, we might only have 1 or 2 sites at which to compare our model grid cells to observational data. And so it makes it very challenging to validate a model like this. Of course, we do it, but we also look for alternative ways of model validation. And so Stacy led a second study. And this was a project that she completed partially with the support of Microsoft Research. And you may be wondering, what does Microsoft Research care about air quality in Chicago? And researchers in Chicago and residents of Chicago were also very curious about this. But just a few years ago, Microsoft Research showed up and said they had a whole bunch of money and they were going to deploy low-cost sensors throughout Chicago. And they did this in an excellent manner. They talked to the community groups and asked community groups, where do you want sensors to be deployed? And they talked about the idea that they would be there to support those community groups as this data came forward and that analysis had to be done and interpretation had to be done. In addition to asking community groups where to site these monitors, they also ran some machine learning algorithms that suggested these are the locations that would be ideal to monitor. And so they ultimately found, or they ultimately deployed 119 low-cost sensors across Chicago. These things monitored temperature and a number of different pollutants, one of which was NO2, but they also tracked particulate matter and some others. As part of Stacy's internship, she designed a study to compare those eclipse data with our model simulations and also to look at some remotely sensed data. And in this case, she looked at trope-omi data. So in this, what we're talking about with remote sense data is column integrated data. So this is not nose level, breathing level data. This is the whole column of the atmosphere as the satellite sees it. And in this case, the trope-omi data has an overpass of about 1 p.m. over Chicago, just once per day. And so the comparison is not perfect because it's column integrated and it's just one hour per day. But it's another data source that we can compare against. The eclipse data here in panel A shows hotspots in Chicago, particularly on the west side of Chicago. And our worst CMAQ simulation shows those highways light up again. And has a bit of overlap with the west side hotspot. And then Tropomi is showing a hotspot over the west side as well. And so one of the primary takeaways from this data comparison was that we thought it was pretty unfortunate that these three state-of-the-art data sets did not agree with one another. Ideally, we would want them all to agree, and we'd arrive at some sort of Venn diagram of truth. But what we can say is that there are places that they do agree, and that's certainly on the west side of Chicago. There seems to be elevated pollution. We did this analysis for 2 separate months, and that west side hotspot of nitrogen dioxide pollution was consistent between the 2 months. All right, so that was the model validation phase of the project. And then Stacy is in the process of completing one last study, and that is looking at the exposure and health disparities of these pollutants across the landscape of Chicago. And so in this case, the plots along the top here are the same plots that you saw previously, only this time they are interpolated to individual census tracts across the city. And on average, each census tract in the city receives about 4 grid cells from the WARF CMAQ simulations. And then along the bottom panel, you can see the demographic distribution of populations across the city. And this is from the American Community Survey. And probably the first thing you'll notice is that Chicago is an incredibly segregated city. In fact, the spatial gradients of demographics are even steeper than the pollutant gradients that we were seeing before. And this sort of distribution of demographics, particularly with the distribution of the 3 different pollutants, has interesting implications. And so we can overlay different demographic categories. We can look at low or high income, or we can look at different race and ethnicities. In this case, the pollution exposure along the 0 line here, right down the middle, is the average of all of Chicago. And what you'll note is that there's no single pollutant that predominantly affects a single race or ethnicity in a negative way. In fact, the signals here are quite mixed. And you can think about this as we start to think about solutions, right? This is indicative of the challenge of designing or pulling policy levers to create solutions across a landscape like Chicago. All right. So that's the setup. We have a model that we think relatively well predicts where pollution is high in Chicago. There's obviously room for improvement there. But using this model, we're now going to move into the world of solutions. And in this case, we're going to focus on vehicle electrification. We focus on vehicle electrification because it's interesting, particularly from a chemistry perspective, but it's certainly not the only solution. Active transport would be another great solution with lots of co-benefits, but it's not something that we worked on in this particular study. When we think about vehicle electrification and we think about what we need to do in our model setup to accurately simulate the electrification of vehicles, there's kind of 2 sides of the emission coin that we need to tackle. One is the on-road emissions, where we're going to see a decrease in tailpipe emissions. We don't necessarily see a decrease in brake and tire wear, so we don't simulate that, but we do see a decrease in tailpipe emissions. The other place that we'll see a change in emissions is the electricity generation units or power plants. And so to charge the batteries in these EVs, we have to somehow determine the change in demand at different powering at EGUs or power stations. And so these are all things that we account for, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But then after we run our sensitivity simulations, which we have a couple of in terms of the number of and type of vehicles that are electrified, we examine pollutant changes, we examine the health implications of those pollutant changes, and then I'll talk a little bit about the environmental disparities. after we simulate them. And this is an academic exercise, but it's also something really important to people. Like, we've grown accustomed to having things that we like. And one of the things we like could be Cheetos, and we want to have access to Cheetos. And so heavy-duty vehicles and transportation within cities is incredibly important to our modern economy and our way of life. And so perhaps there's a slightly better way to get your Cheeto fix. All right. So this is kind of the underlying model setup or the experimental design. On the left-hand side here, you're looking at changes in NOx, and these are on-road NOx emissions. And so the scenarios we run are an instantaneous electrification of a certain swath of vehicles. And so I'll talk about 30% of all vehicles on the road are getting electrified, or 30% of heavy-duty vehicles are getting electrified. And so what that looks like from an on-road emission standpoint is on the left. And again, it kind of just looks like an atlas of maps, or an atlas of roadways with a lot of detail, actually, which is pretty good to see. So we see decreases in NOx emissions across the board. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at the various power plants. These are non-renewable power plants that are spread across the nation. And so we map onto this grid network the needed increases in demand at various power facilities. We have a weighting algorithm that we use to do this. And in the case of that domain that you're looking at over the southern Lake Michigan area, that accounts for about 70% of the added electricity required to power the vehicles that we're talking about. Because of the way the grid works, not all of those power plants are in our highest resolution domain. So that's something to bear in mind as you see more results. All right, so the first study was led by an undergrad that I had the benefit of working with for 4 whole years, which was an awesome experience. And by the time he was done and wrote his undergraduate thesis, it turned into this paper. So he wrote the study from my group that looks at the electrification of all modes of transportation. All modes means what? Well, it means light-duty vehicles like passenger cars and trucks. It means motorcycles and mopeds. And it means heavy-duty vehicles. And so this is anything from 2 tractor trailers behind a tractor rig, or refuse vehicles, or school buses, RVs, so on and so forth, basically everything. And so we instantaneously electrify 30% of all of these modes of transportation. We remap all the emissions, and we put it into our WRF CMAQ simulation. And we can then do comparisons between our baseline simulation and these simulations where we electrify the vehicles. And then we can create difference plots. And that's what you're looking at here. You're looking at differences in concentrations of different health harmful pollutants across our modeling domain. On the left-hand side, you can look at the changes in nitrogen dioxide. They're all negative, at least as far as you can see. There are increases in here. There are red spots at EGUs, but they're so minor that they don't show up on this depiction. On the right-hand side, the far right-hand side, you can see the changes in particulate matter. And in this case, again, we're seeing largely negative changes in particulate matter across our modeling domain. And then in the middle, you're seeing changes in ozone concentrations. And this may or may not be surprising to you, depending on your knowledge of atmospheric chemistry. But when we remove NOx pollution from tailpipes, we are removing NO2, or rather, we are removing NO, and NO titrates ozone. And so with that removal of the NOx pollution, ozone can slightly increase across places that are saturated in NOx relative to VOCs. And so this is a phenomenon that is quite expected. It's something that was identified years ago, and it's called the weekend effect, where less traffic on weekends resulted in slight ozone increases during the weekend. All right, so this is the changes in the concentration of pollutants. We can then look at the changes in premature mortality as a result of these changes in pollutants. And so again, on the left-hand side, you're looking at NO2, on the right-hand side, PM, and in the middle, ozone. Now we're looking at this information on the census tract level, so it's been replotted. And we do this because demographics matter, and in particular, susceptibility of different populations matters. And so different populations respond to different environmental stressors in different ways for various reasons. And so what we find is that because of those ozone increases, we see about 80 added deaths per year over a modeling domain. But we see decreases in premature mortality in both PM and in particular in nitrogen dioxide. And the quantification of reductions in premature mortality due to NO2 pollution is a relatively new thing that epidemiologists have started to do. And I think there'll be more and more folks moving in this direction as the evidence accumulates that NO2 is a health harmful and to the degree that it results in premature mortality. Okay, so this is our simulation where we're looking at the electrification of 30% of all modes of transport. And what we found is that actually the majority of the benefits that we simulated came from the heavy-duty vehicle sector. And so we also ran very similar simulations where we only electrified the heavy-duty vehicle fleet, again, just 30% of it. And we quantified what impact that would have. And one of the things that I can demonstrate by these 4 plots along the bottom is that the health impacts of changes in pollutant concentrations don't always fall where the largest changes in pollutants occur. And so what do I mean here? Well, if you look at the plot E and the dark blue areas are places where the NO2 reductions are the largest when we electrify heavy-duty vehicles. What you'll note is that the change in NO2 attributable mortality is not that great on panel F in that region. And that largely has to do with the susceptibility of the populations that live in those places. And we constrain susceptibility here by looking at mortality rates. And so what is susceptibility? Well, it basically is a metric that tracks a population's ability to deal with environmental stressors. And so why might a certain population have higher susceptibility than another? Well, it can come for a number of different reasons, and many of them are systematic in the US. It could be lack of access to healthcare. It could be lack of access to non-racist healthcare. It could be a number of other factors that are leading to certain populations having a more challenging time dealing with environmental stressors. So the last thing we can do is take all of this information that we have simulated and overlay it with demographics across Chicago. And so the demographics on this particular plot are indicated along the bottom by color. And these are deciles of, on the left-hand side, the change in nitrogen dioxide concentrations. And on the right-hand side, the change in nitrogen dioxide attributable mortality rates. And so just concentrating on the left-hand side, you can see along the top here, this is the smallest decreases in NO2 exposure and where they're occurring and which populations or demographics are receiving those smallest decreases in NO2 exposure. And the largest piece of that decile is actually composed of the dark blue color here, and that's the Black population in Chicago. And then the largest decreases in NO2 exposure are occurring in majority people of color census tracts, but there's a large portion of the area that is also white. Now, you might suspect that this same pattern would carry over when we're looking at premature mortality, but in fact, it does not. And so in this case, the smaller health benefits are at the top, and the larger health benefits are at the bottom, at the 10th decile. And what we see is that the largest reduction in premature mortality, so the largest health, the largest health benefits are occurring in the Black population. And so this is an interesting environmental justice story, and it somewhat depends on whether you're talking about exposure or the public health impact. So that was our study, and we ended up working with a group by the name of the Environmental Defense Fund to present our work to community groups. And this turned out to be an incredibly valuable experience, and I wanted to include it in this talk because I think it's the most valuable thing that we did was present our peer-reviewed academic study to community groups, particularly because the feedback was tremendous. The feedback we got was that the community groups did not feel that our model simulations lined up with their lived experience. And so what they told us was that they did not see enough benefits on the west side, particularly the southwest side of Chicago, as a result of these vehicle electrification scenarios. We have a number of community groups and environmental groups and environmental justice groups across Chicago that are quite active in studying the reasons pollution might be bad. In fact, there's an organization by the name of El Viejo who has partnered with the Center for Neighborhood Technology to create truck counts across their neighborhoods. And essentially what they thought was that there weren't enough baseline emissions in particular neighborhoods. And so this was really interesting feedback for us to get. We're using national emissions inventory data, but we're doing it at a scale that is kind of new at these neighborhood scales. The other piece of feedback that the community group gave us was that, why are you simulating 30% of all vehicles? This 30% number is not at all valuable or helpful for us when we go to our legislators and try to advocate for a particular policy. And specifically, we met with an organization by the name of the Net Z Coalition. The Net Z Coalition is a group of nonprofits, environmental justice organizations, and transportation advocates that are interested in getting heavy-duty diesel vehicles off the road. And they have been meeting with the Illinois legislature in Springfield on a regular basis to attempt to get them to adopt the policy that California passed called the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, or ACT. And what these community groups said was that the thing that would be most beneficial to us would be for you to simulate the ACT and us be able to take that information and give it to our legislators to advocate for something quite specific. And so all of this feedback turned out to be quite tremendous for us. And in fact, we took that information and partnered with these community groups and have since turned this into 2 new funded proposals to do exactly what the community wanted us to do. So we're simulating the ACT along with a number of other policies that are on the books. And we're attempting to augment the NEI emissions using some other information from our local partners in terms of where heavy-duty vehicles are frequenting and what they're doing when they're there. And so I thought, for a long time, I thought one of the pinnacles of research is publishing in fancy journals, but it turns out presenting your fancy published work to community groups is even a higher pinnacle to achieve, because there's lots of great ideas there. And then you can do research that has direct policy impact. All right, so that's everything I wanted to talk to you about today. I think the primary message I wanted to give was that EVs on net are a positive. That's what our research finds. I didn't talk about this a lot, but greenhouse gases, we simulated those as well, and we do see a reduction in greenhouse gases in all scenarios that we simulate. But we also see these reductions in air pollutants, and so the co-benefits of these are the real selling point. One of the other things to mention is that the EPA is really interested in attainment, and Chicago has been in non-attainment for ozone pollution for a long time, multiple decades now. And our simulations indicate that with the electrification of vehicles, we might see a slight increase in ozone, and we've looked at that through an attainment day focus and found that there may be increases in the number of days where Chicago is no longer meeting their attainment status. And so this is incredibly bad from Chicago's perspective because there are actual penalties that the EPA can implement on the city. And so this idea that we should focus only on single pollutants to reward cities from a carrot or stick perspective is perhaps questionable, particularly when we're talking about challenging pollutants like ozone and the various levers that we can pull to help try to solve that problem. The next kind of takeaway I'd like to discuss a little is just that the IRA put subsidies or incentives for individuals to buy light-duty vehicles and get rebates. And I think this is an incredibly beneficial policy. But our research indicates that from a pollution standpoint, when we're talking about air pollutants and health harmful pollutants, there's probably more bang for the buck if we think more about heavy-duty vehicles. And I'm not saying this to say that I think the IRA legislation was bad, but I think there needs to be something in addition to that that targets the heavy-duty vehicle sector, because we have to do both, right? We can't choose one or the other. And then lastly, for all this research, I wanted to thank the funders, which included a philanthropical gift from the Ubben family, Microsoft Research, a couple NSF awards, and the Environmental Defense Fund. And lastly, all of this work, as much work in the Earth System Sciences, was incredibly interdisciplinary and collaborative. And so a number of students and other researchers at other institutions were instrumental to it being successful. So thank you to all of them. And thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Dr. Horton. That was great. So we already have 2 questions in the chat. I'm just going to go ahead and queue them chronologically. So Eric, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about your first slides on air stagnation, but also have you thought about or considered the impact of increasing urban temperatures and heat waves as well in sort of that coupled problems with air quality?
I've definitely thought about it. I have not implemented it in my model simulations as of yet. I do a number of I wear a number of different research hats. And one of the other research hats I wear is that I'm the co-lead of a group that is developing a heat vulnerability index for the city of Chicago. This is an effort in conjunction with the Chicago Department of Public Health. And it's a community-based participatory research project, which means that the community is co-decision makers with the rest of us, right? So we have municipal partners, we have academic partners, and a number of community members, and we're all co-designing a heat vulnerability index for the city. This is part of Chicago's 2022 Climate Action Plan. As part of that work, I am focused primarily on heat, but I often get the question in that environment, are you also interested in air quality? And so the answer is yes, absolutely. And I know that these things can have synergistic negative effects. And at some point, I would like to examine them simultaneously, but I have not yet done that for the EV work or or on the HVI side of things.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Ross, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, thanks. Hey, yeah, wonderful work, Daniel. You'll be shocked to discover that Baltimore has similar problems. I guess a quick comment would be if you decrease NOx, you might see a little improvement in downtown in Duluth, but Muskegon, Michigan will get a lot of benefit out of that. Uh, uh, that's a funny story about this small community on the other side of the lake that's non-attainment for ozone, or at least has been. The serious question relates to black carbon. I guess two questions. One is, what do you think of black carbon relative to other PM as a cause of morbidity and mortality? And what I put in the chat was, what about, there's typically a fat tail on the distribution of emissions for vehicles, and it's trucks in this case that are in poor repair. And guess which neighborhoods they tend to drive around in most. So comments on that are welcome.
Yeah, sure. And I think I'll start out with your Muskegon, Michigan comment, because I think it's an interesting story. I had mentioned the ozone non-attainment for Chicago, but there are a number of places along the Lake Michigan shoreline that are in a similar boat from their ozone non-attainment status. And they're rural areas. And it turns out that the lake breeze and the interaction of the lake breeze with the pollutants that come off of the highways and off of the city of Chicago, those pollutants go out over Lake Michigan. There's not a lot of places for them to be deposited. And so they get often blown back over shore, not over the city, in other locations. And so you have non-attainment status for rural Wisconsin or rural Muskegon, Michigan. And this is a huge issue, and it's an issue of the sort of scale where they spend millions of dollars in observational campaigns to try to understand what's happening. So just this past year, we had both the NASA STAX campaign and the NOAA Aroma campaign in Chicago, taking air quality measurements and flying airplanes and doing ground monitoring to try to get a better handle on these issues. And so you're right, reduction in NOx may not benefit Chicago, but it certainly will benefit other locations, maybe further afield. In terms of your other questions, yeah, the toxicity of various particulate matter components is a really interesting subject that I personally haven't delved into that much, but I have talked to folks, particularly people doing analyses of different forms of PM or constituents of PM to look at the toxicity. And I think it's an interesting area of research, particularly with regard to its intersection with health. And I would love to do more on that. We just haven't yet done it. I know my postdoc, who I forgot to mention her, she's responsible for the heavy duty work, Sarah Camilleri, is particularly interested in different components of PM and the negative consequences. And so I think that'll be work that we need to engage when moving forward. And then you had a third point, and I'm trying to remember. I had a response, but I can't remember exactly what it was about.
It was a fat tail distribution on emissions that you don't usually get a Gaussian distribution.
Oh, right.
Well maintained, yeah.
Yes. So I had mentioned that along with the community groups, we'd gotten some additional research funded. And one of those projects is about fleet renewal. And so what are understanding the barriers for the folks that own fleets to replace their older vehicles. And so there's not only the issue of particularly of drayage vehicles or the vehicles that just go across cities as opposed to be interstates. A number of them have defeat devices, which defeat emission control devices that are on the vehicles. But a number of them are just old, and so they're particularly pollutant intense. And so the work that's been funded is both to simulate what would happen if we got rid of older vehicles and replace them with newer vehicles, but also to understand kind of the thinking at both the community level and the industry level behind fleet renewal and what are the barriers there. And so I think that's a great point that a lot of the fix here could be just on a very targeted segment of the transportation sector.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions while we have Dr. Horton? You can raise your hand, or everyone should be able to unmute themselves. Okay. Well, unless I am interrupted, which feel free to do that, I think we can go ahead and conclude today's seminar. So thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to Dr. Horton for giving us this great talk. As always, we oh, would you like to make the PowerPoint available? Good comment, Russ.
Sure, I can do that.
Great. So when I have that, I will just put that on the event site. So the same site that has all of the other information about the seminar. Okay, and our seminar series will continue same time, same place next week, the 23rd at 2 o'clock. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely afternoon.